Hello and welcome to Step Up Nigeria's podcast. Our podcast is an initiative built to create awareness of governance issues that highlight the cause of corruption and the impact on service delivery. Our podcast also hopes to shape the discussions around topical issues as they relate to the fight against corruption in Nigeria. My name is Fermi Adeola and I am the host of this podcast. And for the first time, we have a video podcast. And on our podcast today, we discussed why tackling corruption is crucial in ensuring an effective response to tackling COVID-19. And on our podcast today, we have two very special guests with us today. Our first podcast guest is Blair Glenkos. He's the Executive Director of Accountability Lab Global, and he recently wrote an article on why tackling corruption is crucial to the global coronavirus response. In the article, he spoke about a number of stories around the world that show corruption has undermined the fight against the novel coronavirus. He argues that tackling corruption is crucial to an effective coronavirus response. He's also joined by our Executive Director, Mrs. Onyinye O. Thank you so much for joining our podcast. We're glad to have you both here today. We've read through your article and we're really moved by the issues that you raised. And there are views that there may be some high risk of corruption as countries try to tackle this global pandemic. What are some of the high corruption risk areas that countries should be aware of? We'll start with you, Blair.
Okay, well, thanks so much. And I'm a big fan of Step Up Nigeria and all the work that you do. And I think working with young people in particular around these issues is essential because it is going to be a generational change. Corruption is not something that we can tackle quickly or easily, and it's going to take a whole new generation of young people to come through and do things differently. Which brings us to coronavirus and corruption. The challenge, I think, is that there are many ways that corruption can affect the response, but dealing with them now as it's happening is very difficult. We should have created the ways and means to deal with this problem beforehand so that we're not trying to deal with it in the middle of a global crisis where we can't meet each other and where there are all sorts of other constraints on these sorts of issues. I think there's a few different ways that corruption is affecting coronavirus. The first, of course, is that corruption in many ways caused this crisis. It's a health crisis, but largely because health systems have been gutted by corruption through large-scale graft and mismanagement over many years in many, many countries. So they are already unable to deal with this. I think second, the response to the crisis is leading already to massive amounts of corruption because there's so much money being put into financial systems and being spent by governments to try and deal not just with the immediate health challenges, but all of the economic challenges that come with it. And all of that requires a lot of contracting, a lot of procurement, a lot of different ways that corruption can potentially happen, or that money can be used for means that it perhaps wasn't intended for. And thirdly, all of this undermines trust in governments, and trust is exactly what's needed the most at the moment to deal with this challenge. If people don't believe what their governments are saying is true, if they don't adhere to government guidelines, then this is only going to get worse in all sorts of ways, and so in that way, corruption is making the larger issues even more difficult and undermining this social contract that we need between governments and people to deal with all of this. So there's many areas I think that we're going to face challenges with corruption, and we need to get hold of this problem and deal with it very, very quickly. Otherwise, this pandemic is going to go on longer and is going to be more severe than we have hoped, I think.
Thank you very much. Oni, would you like to give some thoughts as to some high corruption risk areas that you think countries should be aware of?
Yes, to support what Blair has said, I totally agree. Like one area that corruption, has, poses a high risk is in the procurement sector, like we've seen, particularly around medical supplies, but more particularly for even across not just in Nigeria, but across the globe, there are a number of relief measures being done by the states, by the government to help to cushion the effects of corruption on workers or businesses or poor people. And those initiatives, have, high corruption risk. Like, for example, I would use Nigeria as an example. The government has, announced a number of palliative measures, to help the poor, but there's there are outcries around the lack of transparency in the selection of beneficiaries for these palliatives. We don't know, and even private sector, lots of billionaires have given funding towards these palliative measures, but we don't know, so how is this funding disbursed? So I think those are some of the questions and some of the challenges we see. And like Blair mentioned, most countries are in lockdown. So who are you going to see to ask, how do you even get this information? Other than what I see is people just asking questions on social media, on Twitter, which, is just more like, so we're crying out on Twitter, but that's about it. But so it's difficult to access information, and which makes, creates sort of some kind of lack of transparency, around efforts to effectively respond to these issues. And then I think another area which gives me concern as well is around the research and development side of things for drugs or vaccines. That's one area, people, I feel it's quite secretive, in the sense that we don't really hear much other than, clinical trials are being done. And lots of, we can imagine with COVID, I can imagine the amount of funding that's gone into that area. And I think it's one area that I feel is, has a high risk of, corruption happening there, either in terms of the companies, the pharmaceutical companies that would end up developing whatever drug the clinical trials, produce. And I think it's important that we also monitor that side of things and ensure that, the actual drugs or vaccines that will be produced actually are have passed the clinical trials and are not, have not been subjected to any bias just to favor a particular company. So I think those are some of the areas I think that have some high, risk of corruption.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Oyin. From both your discussions, it seems that corruption will pose to be a major stumbling block to tackling this epidemic in most countries. And it's really just brought the world to a halt. So, Blair, do you agree that corruption is hindering the current efforts to effectively tackle the COVID-19 pandemic?
Absolutely. It's in some ways it's difficult to tell because it's happening now, and we can't necessarily see it. It will perhaps only be clear sort of a bit further down the line once audits have been done, for example, and once some of the checks and balances have been fully put in place and then implemented, that we'll really see how bad it is. But I was on a call last night with Delia Ferreira, the chair of Transparency International, and she made the interesting point that during the Ebola crisis in West Africa in 2014, 2015, it was really only long after the crisis that we realized how much money had been stolen and how much corruption was happening. Whereas now, because this crisis is so much bigger and it's happening in so many other places, and we've reached a point now where things like social media are so much more ubiquitous, that we are beginning to pick up on it more quickly. And we can see some of what's happening. We can see contracts that are not transparent. We can see people that are using information to get access to funding streams in ways that they shouldn't. We can see when materials are going astray. All of these sorts of things, and I think that is absolutely undermining our response. And depending on how broadly you're defining corruption, I think we could also bring the issue of power grabs and abuses of human rights into this. Many countries, of course, are using this opportunity to consolidate. Leaders of these countries are using this opportunity to consolidate their power to make decisions that are giving them authority that they will not like to relinquish, closing civic space, and in that way creating or reinforcing patronage networks and corrupt systems that benefit the few at the expense of the many. And we can see that happening in real time. And civil society is organizing in many places, including Nigeria, to push back. And those voices are more necessary than ever because, if governments for good or bad reasons are making decisions without engaging citizens, then in the long run, that's going to undermine their legitimacy and lead to a lack of accountability in the conditions in which corruption can happen. So it is a big problem. It's a big part of what we need to think about when it comes to the response, and it's young people like Step Up Nigeria and Accountability Lab Nigeria and others who I think should be doing it.
Yeah, I agree, Blair, because one of the things that I think that it's really hindering the efforts to effectively, reduce the spread is around the contact tracing and just trying to reduce. And, so there are a lot of issues. Some of them may not necessarily just be corruption related. Some of them could just be like people are afraid of stigma or social issues. But we've also seen how corruption is actually affecting contact tracing. Like, for example, there's been a number of cases in Nigeria, and I think I've read in other countries as well, where doctors in private hospitals are deliberately or secretly treating people without, providing official records to. So they've been paid, by either their friends or may not even be friends or family, but just been paid, probably a good amount of money to treat them in this expensive private hospital. And then this data is not released to government, and they probably are not have been accredited to actually treat COVID-19 patients, and that's actually posing a problem around the spread. Some of the states that this spread to in Nigeria was around this kind of evading quarantine and isolation rules and meeting, doctor friends and, to get treatment. I think it's a big issue. So we, beyond the public sector, the private sector, and even citizens generally actually have a role, I think, to play in this area. They also are, contributing to some of the, corruption we are seeing, which is, affecting the effort. So I think that's something as well that, NGOs should emphasize on.
Thank you. Quite concerning. So it's a big problem, like you've both expressed. What can we do? What can be done to prevent or tackle corruption in these areas?
We can do. The first is really push for transparency in every respect. Transparency is not enough to create accountability and not enough to fight corruption, but it's a starting point. So we should demand that governments, for example, are making all of their contracting, all of their tenders, all of their procurement completely open. That's open bidding, open information, all data out there according to open data standards, so that it can be seen, it can be synthesized, it can be used by organizations to see exactly what money is being spent where, which materials are being given to whom, all of that side of things. So that's, I think, one big piece. I think we secondly need to really focus on the oversight mechanisms to ensure that any efforts related to coronavirus are effective and accountable. So that means, for example, really strengthening inspectors general or other people of authority who are independent and objective and can review all of these processes. So depoliticizing this as much as possible. Organizations like anti-corruption commissions or auditing commissions, all of these types of bodies, really make sure that they are strengthened, that they are in the loop on all of this, and that they can monitor what's happening. On the flip side, I think civil society organizations, as we've discussed, need to step up, make sure they are asking the right questions, really pushing people in power to answer for their decisions, constantly following the money, checking social media, encouraging investigative work into any kinds of claims against anyone in power who might be using that power in untoward ways. That, of course, relates to the media too, that always has a critical role to play in building accountability, and now I think even more so than ever. And then there's much more, but one other final point that I would make is I think we need to change the narrative too, and really think through values and ethics and how we can push people within systems that have integrity to positions of power, so that those decisions that they make are reflective of their values, and celebrate people doing the good things, connect them, reinforce those networks, so that they can push back against people within systems that perhaps might want to do the wrong thing or partake in corruption.
Yeah, I agree with Blair on that in terms of like the values. I think there's long-term solution to beyond COVID-19. Possibly we may have another pandemic, God knows, another 6 years. Well, we don't pray for that, but we just have to prepare, right? And when we've seen the pandemics, COVID-19 is just, it's been a bit strange because it's kind of hit more countries than normal, but we've had like Ebola, which wasn't as widespread, but more in West Africa, and so we keep on having this. They come and go, and so I think it's like Blair said, is important, and I think that's the what we are seeing. Well, my own observation, just seeing how people are behaving during this period in terms of even following the rules around isolation, quarantine, those things just makes me reflect on the need to have like integrity, on the need, because when you have integrity, there's more likely you like to follow rules. So both integrity in public office, integrity as a citizen, I think that's important. And I think continuous long-term education around these values as a foundation, for being, for fighting corruption is important. And I think another thing is just closely linked to what you said about the role of civil society, empowering NGOs for NGOs to empower communities with the information around what's happening in their communities. I'll use Nigeria again as an example. There are lots of palliative measures that are being undertaken by government to ease this pandemic on the poor. But some of the poor people don't even know, the selection criteria, and then there's a lot of confusion. And I think whether it's done purposely or just by accident, mixing a lot of programs together. So genuine programs that government was already doing with the palliative, just before COVID-19, a lot of confusion and lack of transparency, and maybe probably lack of communication around what is what. And I don't know whether it's done deliberately to confuse people, but I think it's important as a society, we find out what the real information is, avoid fake news and empower communities with the right information so they can hold the leaders to account. And also, I think also educate the public around the real cost of corruption. Generally, I think it's important during this period as well. Like, because, for example, I mentioned earlier about doctors in the hospitals, collecting bribes and allowing people to evade quarantine measures that government has set up. And I think if they understand, and even as doctors they should know, but if the message is reinforced around the cost of that one or two persons, and how they become super spreaders, and this thing goes on and on, to the economy, to the lives of people, then maybe possibly people may begin to have a bit of thing. Because most times I keep on saying this, even beyond COVID-19, there's the issue of corruption. Everybody understands that it is bad. Everybody understands that it has effects. But what I'm not too sure is really done enough sometimes around the real cost to human lives. And I think reiterating that message, particularly during this time when the risks are high, is very important. And also reiterating the message around values and empowering communities with the right information, I think possibly is one way to go beyond the other measures. And they're like Blair said, there's so many things that can be done, but this just the areas I think that we could emphasize.
Thank you, Oyin. And honestly, I think there's no better two people to be having this discussion with, because Accountability Lab and Step Up Nigeria are completely around changing these social norms and values that drive corruption, that would make people demand for accountability and transparency. So with all the doom and gloom, do you think that this global epidemic can lead to a positive shift in behaviors and attitudes towards demanding for transparency and accountability in delivery of services by citizens? Do you really think this will cause or spark any change in citizens' behavior and more responsiveness from the government as well? We can start with Blair.
So what's interesting about this crisis, and Nigeria is a great example, is that suddenly the corrupt elites who have been avoiding taxes and avoiding using public services forever are now trapped in a country where they have to now use these services, and are realizing the effect that their behavior has had. And I think that could lead to a new consensus on not just on the importance of sort of tax paying and public services, but potentially on the social contracts, if there's enough of a push from citizens. And of course, it's not just Nigeria, it's the same in the US, where universal healthcare has been something that's been impossible politically for a long time, but suddenly there's discussions about how that might happen, or universal basic income, all of these sorts of things in Western countries And so I think there's the same opportunity in a different way, potentially in places like Nigeria, to find consensus around some of these sorts of things in ways that didn't exist before. And at the same time, I think this crisis is forcing us to completely reimagine what's possible. We're having to totally transform the way we work, the way we live, the way we communicate. And that too, I think, is going to provide opportunities for civil society and for governments to reinvent themselves, to get better, to be better, hopefully. And for us who are interested in corruption and accountability, to push them to do that. And I do think this is a moment where suddenly things are open in a way that they have not been in our lifetimes, definitely.
Yeah.
Politically. So we can make the changes that we want to see, but it has to be a collective effort. It has to be coherent, and it has to be very well planned. I think if we continue to do what we normally do, I think, unfortunately, which is often do lots of different things in very stovepiped ways and don't communicate and don't come together, then it's going to be tricky. But if this crisis is doing anything, it's bringing people together in new ways. So I think there is real potential.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Blair. I think Blair has touched on many points I wanted to make, particularly from the Nigerian example. I mean, there are two countries I wanted to give an example of how this, I think, may change. But then, at the same time, I also have my pessimistic side that says, okay, maybe probably after we go back to normal, people forget all that we went through. But currently, where I sit, particularly I think I was really taken aback by the Nigerian billionaires and elites. It really struck me for the first time, like, no place to run. What COVID-19 has shown them was the importance of investing in your healthcare systems. Prior to now, Step Up Nigeria had done a lot of reviews on the audit reports, that shows how funds, have been diverted over the years, for the construction of healthcare facilities in rural communities. We've even seen a case I mentioned in the last podcast around one of the funding for a healthcare facility that was turned into a king's palace. So this is how monies over the years have just been diverted for things, that would have benefited us now. And even more disturbing is even at the seat of power, where the Aso Rock, the Aso Rock Clinic, which is supposed to be the state clinic for where the president, for the president's office, is not even, with all the funding that has gone there, it's not even, it can't even handle a crisis like this. So that, I think it brought a sense of reflection. And I had the SGF, the secretary to the government of the Federation, was it a couple of weeks back, saying, which was also, that tells you the story of Nigeria, saying, oh, I didn't know our healthcare facilities was this bad. And I had to laugh. How would you not know our healthcare facilities? Because you don't use it. You go abroad, and for the first time, borders were shut. Like, to anyone, money couldn't even, billionaires couldn't even pay the most expensive doctor in the UK or wherever to access treatment, because the UK itself and the US are even struggling to even, take care of their own patients. And I think it's important. That's, for me, that has been, one of the most, reflective lessons from this whole saga, like the need to have your own healthcare systems, particularly when you have nowhere to run. There was nowhere to run for anybody. And what we saw was now an outpour of large donations. I didn't know where the 1 billion existed before now, but 1 billion naira here, 1 billion, just pouring in from rich Nigerians. And I was like, oh my God, if all these monies, were invested in Nigeria's healthcare system, possibly would have had enough ventilators or protective equipment for staff to deal with these issues. And it's not just Nigeria, even some of the Western countries. We're seeing change, and I'm hoping that possibly would see, a bit more, this would, make governments in various countries think about ways of doing things, think about the welfare of the poor, think about the welfare of citizens, and try to invest in country systems, particularly in the health sector. I see, I'm hoping that people don't forget, because the human nature tends to forget. I'm hoping that, if everything dies down and everybody goes back to normal, we will remember this moment and actually, have a call to action to invest in our health system.
Yeah, thank you. It's quite a concerning matter, but like you both said, the good part is that our political elite are no longer disconnected from the reality of the everyday Nigerian. Now they understand the pains. The same markets are closed. The virus attacks anyone. So this thing is a general problem. They will be forced to face it. So last question, Blair. In your article, you say societies around the world must begin a large-scale effort to promote integrity and change the incentives that lead to corrupt behavior. So in like a step-by-step process, how do you recommend citizens go about this to better hold their governments accountable?
So I can give you an example, which is a program that we run at the Accountability Lab in Nigeria and in other countries called Integrity Icon. And that is a TV show and a campaign to find the most honest government officials and turn them into celebrities. We call it naming and faming the good people rather than naming and shaming the bad people. And why this is important is because such a big part, we would argue, of corruption is about norms. It's about the expected behaviors in society, and in many countries, corruption has become the expected behavior. Becoming wealthy at any cost has become the goal. And so serving citizens, being a person of integrity and building accountability are not the objectives, and we need to change that. And one way to do that is to very publicly celebrate and appreciate people that are doing the right thing. The other thing that this does is creates role models for young people. We've discussed why it's important that young people are engaged in this process already. If they can see good people within these systems trying to build the kind of change that we need, they can be inspired to do the same. And we've seen this program do that. And thirdly, it gives them hope. When we talk constantly about corruption and theft and people stealing all sorts of public resources and doing all sorts of bad things, it doesn't fill anybody with much hope. And I think we need these stories to show us that there is a different reality and a different kind of future that we can all help to build. And so something like Integrity Icon, where we ask people to nominate honest government officials, and then we make films about the best ones, and then people can vote for their favorites, is a small thing. But we found it really gets people excited. It's very easy to do. They feel like they're taking a small, easy step to nominate or vote. And they can really see the impact because, we get these icons profiled on television. We get coverage in the papers. We then work with them to build systems of integrity. We connect them in coalitions with each other. We help them get promoted. So we sort of try and create this network of people with integrity that inspires others and can change the way that institutions hopefully work over time. So that's one small way I think that we can do it and that we're doing at the Accountability Lab. But I think for citizens and people everywhere, there's many other things that they can be doing. And I think the biggest point is it comes back again to sort of individual values and ethics as a starting point. So this isn't just about pointing fingers at other people and saying, oh, the politicians are corrupt, they've stolen all the money, that's why everything's gone wrong. That may be the case, but they reflect us. And it begins with us living by our values, by keeping our promises, by being people of integrity. And then it will filter upwards and we will get the leaders that we want, which is why the work of Step Up Nigeria is so important. It's why education is critical. It's why being a good parent is essential to bring through this new generation of young people that say together, we want things to be differently. It's too difficult for one person to stand up and say, I'm going to be a person of integrity, because as you know, there are always incentives and systems that push back against that behavior, and it can be very difficult and dangerous in some cases. But what about if we created an entire generation who were all standing up and saying, we're going to make things different, we're going to be people of integrity, and that's how I think things will ultimately change. So we can all do lots of small things every single day to push this agenda and to try and build accountability, and it's just a question of living our lives in that way.
Yeah, and the final word as well for I think our viewers, they're just like Blair, just to reiterate the importance of integrity. I think that they need to build integrity and values, and they need to begin with the young people, as young as, kindergarten, if possible, it's I think the way to go, and hopefully would have a better society.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And I look forward to visiting Nigeria again as soon as I can. It's one of my favorite places. The best jollof rice in West Africa.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Blair. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi there. Thank you so much for watching our podcast. For those who are new to our podcast and this is the first time you're hearing about us or seeing our discussions, I will put the link in the description to our podcast. Our podcast is currently on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Podbean, as well as on our blog on our website. So you can use any of these platforms. That's easy for you to access our podcast and listen to all our previous episodes. This we brought to you was episode 37. Yes, so we hope you enjoyed our podcast. Please remember to follow Step Up Nigeria on social media, on Twitter and Instagram at step_up_Nigeria, on Facebook and LinkedIn at Step Up Nigeria. Thank you so much for listening. Until our next episode, goodbye. Hi there. Thank you so much for watching our podcast. For those who are new to our podcast and this is the first time you're hearing about us or seeing our discussions, I will put the link in the description to our podcast. Our podcast is currently on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Podbean, as well as on our blog on our website. So you can use any of these platforms. That's easy for you to access our podcast and listen to all our previous episodes. This we brought to you was episode 37. Yes, so we hope you enjoyed our podcast. Please remember to follow Step Up Nigeria on social media, on Twitter and Instagram at step_up_Nigeria, on Facebook and LinkedIn at Step Up Nigeria. Thank you so much for listening. Until our next episode, goodbye.